has to be pretty close by the looks of it. And today's theme is more of a training workshop. It's more about trying to look some of the bigger issues and smaller issues. So we thought it might be better that I say a few words now, and then Sheikh Fahd can give the bigger picture. But what I'm going to do today is present something that I personally feel quite strongly about. And I first read it in a book called Spiritual Capital, Wealth We Live By, done by some non-Muslims. Because from an activist point of view, we're trying to find, do we make Islam fit into the lives that we live, or do the lives that we live fit into Islam? How do we try to work this out, and with all the challenges that we find in society? So when I read this book, what they were arguing, and I'll come to that in a minute, is that I'm working on the premise that we are no longer in the middle of the Islamic civilization. The Islamic civilization was a civilization before this current civilization, right? We are all, when the Islamic civilization was dominant, globally people copied and drew from the knowledge and wisdoms from the Islamic civilization. And they built their cultures from that. So the same thing is happening now. We are now part of a global Western corporate sort of globalization civilization, which is dominated more by the financial markets, right? This is everywhere. So therefore, this is the world that we live in, and then as Muslims, we are engaging with this world, and we have to find our purpose and reality in this world. So these people, they were part of the financial world, corporate people, big shots and all that kind of stuff. And then they found there was something missing. They felt, and when I was in Malaysia last time, talking to a lot of young people who were also professionals working in this very fast-paced world, many of them, when you talk to them privately, were saying that there's something missing for them, something of purpose, some value missing for them. And this is being said in everywhere I go. Young people are saying that. They've done everything by the book, the education, the profession, everything, something's missing. So these people, Dana Zohar and Ian Marshall, having been part of this world, felt that there was something missing. And what is it? And they felt that the world that they were living in is very harsh. It's a harsh world that's been created, right? So therefore, from that, having read that book, we did a session some years ago now called, based on those ideas, it's all God's business. So everything is God's business, and therefore spiritual capital and building communities. So if everything is God's business, how do we draw as Muslims from our spiritual capital? What is our spiritual capital in order to build communities, right? So this is a question that for me is my big question that I'm really interested in, right? Because in a sense, once we have an idea of the big picture, we then find our place in it. Because Allah does not ask all of us to do everything, but He asks us to have an understanding, and then we do what we can do in it, right? So therefore, for those of us who are working in the voluntary sector or grassroots, we have to find our specific purpose within it making relevance to the bigger picture. So, where is our spiritual capital? And I'm actually going to draw on a lot of non-Muslims for this, because they're asking these questions. From the book itself, they say, the writer, spiritual capital, by contrast, is wealth that we live by, wealth that enriches our deeper aspects of our lives. It is wealth we gain through drawing upon our deepest meanings, our deepest values, most fundamental purposes and highest motivations, and by finding a way to embed these in our lives and work. And when I read that in the book, I thought, subhanAllah, this is Islam after all, you know? Isn't that what we're told in the Quran? Isn't that the principles that we live by? But we don't use this sort of language in the modern times. And then what they're saying is that, my point then is that a critical mass of individual using their spiritual intelligence, so drawing on these deep-rooted values that we have, ethical principles that we draw on, which motivates our actions, our intentions, using their spiritual intelligence to act from higher motivations, can shift the dominant features of a whole culture, be it that of a family, a community, an organization, or of a whole global culture like capitalism. This is not an advocation for the demise of capitalism, although that's another conversation, but this is just saying that something has gone wrong in capitalism, in the economic structures that we have, where we have lost our sense of humanity. And I just want to quote something from my teacher, Sheikh Halima Krausen, who, in this very sort of world where we live in, where we want immediate outcomes, and even in religion, as we've been talking over these days, that people can refer to Sheikh Google, or immediately on their phones or iPads, can challenge the scholars, or well, no, this hadith and this Quran, instantly, without going through the methodology of engaging and learning, and not everything is instant, right? So she says something which stuck with me, that there are things that grow, because I can be sometimes somebody who wants an answer pretty quick, and I've had to learn myself over the years patience. And I remember some of my teachers in the past saying, look, there's something you don't know now, but you will know in the future. And maybe 5-10 years from now, he goes, remember that thing that I told you then? This is what that's all about. And we've been learning such things from Sheikh Faid over these days. So she says, so therefore, in our human personality, not everything can be made instantly. We cannot make little prototype children. We can't look in a catalogue of what is an ideal Muslim child and say, yes, I want a bit of this and I want a bit of that. No, it doesn't. Children, as those of you who have children know, it doesn't work like that. So you have some ideas and principles which you have embedded inside you, and you enable them to grow. And this is how we look at children. And you who are looking after these children in your center, you have found them in a state of loss instead of crisis, and you are doing that same thing. You are offering them something, and you're giving them the space to grow, because it can't be done overnight. And so what also Sheikh Halima says, what is for her the critical ingredients of this change, right, is 3 things: mercy, rahmah, justice, adl, organic unity, ummah. And why organic unity? Not unity in the way we tend to talk, oh, let's all be unified. No. It's about personal responsibility, being aware of each other without forcing people. You cannot be a community by force. You can't even be a family by force. You can't even practice your religion by force, and we know that, we've been told that, right? So therefore, part of the ingredients when it comes to building this new spiritual capital, the society that we want to live in, is the centered in rahmah, right? And justice. And if you talk to young people today, part of the things that they are saying always is this is not just, this is not right, this is not this. And this is why we find ourselves today in what we call a rights culture. Everything is about rights, 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 rights. Because we have not always been just, and we have not always been fair. So this is what people are saying. And we find ourselves, as you know too well, that there are young people, there are even old people who are not treated justly, and society turns a blind eye. So if society turns a blind eye to this injustice, who is responsible for this, if we know about it, right? And I go back to create a sort of, from trying to understand this from a Quranic point of view, what can we draw on to think about the principles of our spiritual capital? And I always use these verses from Surah Rum, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, and among His signs is this, that He created us from dust, and He created us far and wide. So the core is He created us, and He created for our mates, and the ingredients of that relationship is to be in peace and tranquility with them. Love and mercy is the core of it. And He constantly is telling us to think, to reflect, and our variations, our languages and our colors. And economy comes forth in this list, okay? So just to put this in a diagram form, because I'm a diagram person, okay, that's why I do PowerPoint, is that what that's really saying to me, if I want to say, what is my spiritual capital? What do I draw on? What do I feel from an Islamic Quranic point that I can revive that spiritual capital, right? The center, of course, all of it is that it's related to Allah. He is the center of all things. So He is in the middle who surrounds everything. And next to Him is this relationship between people of love and mercy, and particularly between spouses of rahmah. Because if that relationship does not have rahmah, imagine the consequences, again, as you all know. If that rahmah, the justice and organic unity is not there in our relationships, in a marriage, what are the consequences? Children are not safe, they're brought up in an unhappy home, they get affected by it, they become vulnerable, they experience injustice. As a result of all this injustice, possibly they think religion is the cause of this injustice. Parents might use religion as a way of telling off their children, maybe, right? Which often happens, right? Because that's the only power they have left, is to use religion as a force. So we see the consequences of these things if we don't think about them and we don't try to establish them. And our diversity and the economy comes last of that, fourth in those circles. And these days we find ourselves that the economics of life is actually the center of what we do. We are centered in this dunya world. And I'm not against dunya, right? I'm just saying, but it is controlling everything that we do, and we center ourselves in it, right? So the questions we have to ask ourselves, if we rethink our spiritual capital, how do we try to readdress these balances, the balance of our lives? How do we teach our youngsters and teach ourselves to get back to this center? At one level, all we can do is we can help ourselves. And if we are living the change, then like the quote earlier, that if every individual person is living this change, then this group of people as individuals becomes a big mass. And then you can change society that way. So what do we change? There are many things that we have to think about to recenter it, about its purpose. Education, Islamic education, we've been hearing constantly, and we hear it in England. It's lost its deeper essence. It's become a set of rules and regulations, and we put Sharia before we put the purpose, right? So therefore maybe we have to revitalize our spiritual capital at its source, which is our education. Then our educational establishments, the structures that we live by. For example, I would argue your organization is one of our structures. And how do we support those? And creation of wealth. So therefore, if we are embedded in this sense of awareness of Allah, the wealth we create becomes within the consciousness of what Allah wishes for us in our life, right? And this goes on like that. So like I said, this could be as an individual, we can do this as a group, we can do it as an organization, a project, or a place of worship. It's about rethinking and reorientating our relationship to these in a conscientious way. Because sometimes we just take it for granted in our everyday life. So, going back to the book, what they're saying is in this corporate world, finance-dominated world, we understand what economic wealth is. And economic wealth realized, the globalization, the global corporations, realized that they had to give something back to society. So then we saw the emergence of social capital, right? You must have heard of all of this. So this is big organizations putting money back and doing philanthropic work. But what they have said is, social capital is the wealth that makes our communities and our organization functions effectively for the common good. I strongly believe that really genuine social capital must include the spiritual dimension. It is the cultivation and sharing of our truly ultimate concerns that acts as the real glue to society. So they're saying, even though their social capital is being embedded into economic capital, the dimension that's missing is social capital, so spiritual capital. So within that, unless we have a sense of higher value, higher worship, a purpose, what is this all about, this wealth accumulation, this society that we're building on that? So therefore, big questions that we have to ask. What is our investments in our community? What is our investments as citizens? So therefore, we have individual questions we ask this. And also we must ask, I believe, we must ask our bigger communities. We must put this to the communities and say, this money that you give for zakat and sadaqah and whatever investments that you're making, are we using this to the best advantage? Are we sure that we're using this to connect to all the things that we need to do in society? And I'm going to I'll just say very quickly, from a British point of view, most probably it's the same here. This is not a scientific diagram, it's just something I did very quickly to show that all of our energy goes into building mosques. And we're building mosques upon mosques and mosques, bigger structures. And they are more sort of signs of power and glory than really of community. And the difference we find in the traditional Islamic community structures, mosques were a little bit low-key, they were integrated into the structure of the civil society. People were just walking by in and out, they were part of civil society. But our mosques increasingly becoming these big structures, not connected to the community at all. And we say, mashallah, mashallah, big, beautiful structure. But they have not the essence of what the purpose of the mosque is all about. They cannot serve the community in the way that we expect them because they're not part of it. But these are what we're doing more. And the sort of other things that we put a lot of effort into as doctors, dentists, lawyers, accountants, all these things that we value in order to get our economic wealth. And we need to maybe think that we need to invest in our social workers, our teachers, our health workers, our people who are working on the ground, young people who have got creative new ideas. Invest in those people. So therefore, I'm almost finished, that we have structural deficiencies. This is a sort of diagram to show some of the structural deficiencies in the UK. For you, when you are working and dealing with your biggest structural issues, you have to make your own definition for yourself of what your structural deficiencies are. What is preventing you from doing your work? What makes your work hard? Who is not listening? Why aren't they listening? Who do you want to get your message to? Like we were told yesterday that there are issues. The community is struggling to support the girls and they have to be integrated back in society. And how can we integrate them into society if we're not challenging the attitudes that put them in that place in the first place, right? How do we do that? So we have to ask these. The answer doesn't fall from the sky. We have to ask these questions. We have to think about it. We have to say, who are the things that we can do in order to change that? So we all have to make our own awareness of that. And I give you another example from my teacher, from one way of personal development, of community development, if we're talking about that, is that what she argues, what she says, is that one of the things that we do from a religious point of view, we usually have a model where Allah is in the center, and Allah is about worship. So when you talk to any Muslim about what's your purpose, it's about ibadah, it's about worship. So when you put Allah in the center, what happens is you often don't put yourself in there, because you're saying we need to understand Allah, so we put Him in the center. But if we put ourselves in the center as a community development model, as a personal development model, if we put ourselves in the center, and we say our overall is ibadah, to connect to Allah, to worship Allah, to understand what He expects of us, right? And then we draw on the other things that are in life, are the human beings, creation around, are the living beings, and ourselves. We see that the Quran and the Sunnah has so much to tell us about that, as Sheikh has been telling us. That we then say we worship and we draw insights from this worship from Quran and Sunnah, but the Quran and Sunnah is telling us things about the rest of our life. It's telling us how to be with those people. And this is a personal development. We develop ourselves, we develop our relationship. So we're in a time, I will argue, that we are rebuilding the human potential. So how do we rebuild this human Muslim potential, which is vulnerable and insecure? We want to go a transition from vulnerable to the whole self and citizen, and to be integrated. How do we stop this vulnerability? And if we draw from the Quranic point of view, Islamic point of view, Islam by definition is challenging. It challenges us at every level. It reconnects us to purpose, our spiritual capital. It reconnects you to our spiritual purpose. It empowers us with that spiritual purpose to act. And from that action, we integrate into society. We integrate into our everyday lives. So just to also conclude from some stuff that we did in the past with the Sheikh Hanima was, we did this thing about 10 sunnahs, and inshallah Sheikh Faid will go into the depths about them a little bit more, is 10 sunnahs of community development. We looked at our personal qualities, about community at home, right? The Prophet ﷺ and community life and women within that, children, knowledge, economics, which is not at the top necessarily, community, society, and our relationship to the wider picture, social justice, other faiths, and how to deal with conflicts. So these are not exclusive, but these are some possible areas to think about community development and prophetic sunnahs, and we have so much to draw on from that. And so just to conclude, 6 C's. We need context, we need connecting, we need continuity. One of the biggest problems in Britain, I believe me, is that great initiatives by Muslims, some beautiful stuff happens, but they don't survive. If you're lucky, they survive 5 years. A whole range of reasons, right? We're not consistent. We don't have the capital. We don't have the financial capital. We don't have capacity, and we need change. So these are 6 things that we need to think about when we're thinking about community development, social change. But what I would like to argue that in the modern times, with modern languages relevant to the times that we live, we have to find maybe new expressions and new ways of selling this to a younger generation, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.